And good evening. My name is Risa Edelstein. I'm on the board of the Ecological Landscaping Association, and I am going to be the moderator for this webinar. Um, and I just wanted to welcome everybody to our first webinar of the series titled Ecology Basics for Landscapers and Designers. And this is the first webinar in our series called A Focus on Sustainability. And just a little bit of background is this series was developed by a group of organizations across the country that are known regionally really for their quality education programs. And we are all working together. We're all nonprofit groups, and we're all working together to really try to extend the reach of our educational programs. And in case you're not familiar with the organizations, which, by the way, are mostly volunteer, they're largely volunteer groups. They are the ELA, Ecological Landscape Association, which I'm a part of, and it's mainly in the Northeast, USA, and the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council, which Sylvan's a part of, and she's in the Washington, D.C. area. The other groups are the Midwest Ecological Landscape Alliance, MILA, which is obviously in the Midwest, and Eco Landscape California, which is out west. So the four of the groups really have been working cohesively to try to bring this webinar series to you, and I'm really excited. It's our first one, and so far I don't think we have too many technical issues, so this is great. So we are, as it's our first one, we're getting used to GoToWebinar, and so I just want to let you know that in terms of your questions, I am going to be the moderator getting your questions, and I will forward them to Sylvan, and she will actually have time during her webinar to take some questions. But I will do my best to answer them as you send them off to me. So everybody should see that question box that's in your control panel. So if that's the best way to ask something. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is just welcome Sylvan. It's been very exciting. She has certainly been on our committee helping us. She's been really instrumental in helping us launch this series. And we're excited to have her. She teaches, just a little background, she teaches as an adjunct professor for George Washington University's Sustainable Landscapes program. And she, as I mentioned, she serves on the board of the Chesapeake Conservation Landscaping Council. So we're very excited to have her tonight. And without further ado, I'm going to pass my controls over to her so she can start her presentation. Okay, and I guess I have this huge list of people. Usually it's just one person, but all the attendees. Okay, so Sylvan, I'm passing controls over to you.
Okay, let me just get my PowerPoint up here. Okay, can you all see my screen, I hope?
I can see it, so.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, unfortunately, when you all type in the question box, I can't actually see the answer, so Risa has to forward me whatever you're saying. So as Risa said, my background is in ecology rather than landscape design or installation, but after years of doing research on plant population and community ecology, I began to work as a land manager and curator at Adkins Arboretum in Maryland, which has a focus on native plants of the Chesapeake Bay region. This work connected the principles of ecology to those of gardening and landscape design, and I now teach ecology to landscape designers at George Washington University and to other groups. Currently, I live, work, and garden in both Denton, Maryland and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and New Mexico has certainly been a change in environment from Denton, so that's been very exciting. So ecology is the study of how organisms interact with each other in their environment. This is a picture of my relatively small vegetable garden in Maryland. And I like to think of the garden, not just a vegetable garden, but any garden, as an ecological system or ecosystem. It consists of the species in the garden, the plants, insects, birds, soil bacteria. It also includes the interactions among those species. Bumblebees and honeybees function as pollinators interacting with the plants. And I, as the gardener, select what plants are going to grow there or this afternoon I spent a lot of time weeding out plants that I didn't want in there, like wiregrass. Whatever turf grass person decided that Bermuda grass would be a good plant for turf must never have had a perennial garden or a vegetable garden. This garden, of course, interacts with the environment. It gets sunlight, water. You can see that I give it supplemental water through the drip hoses, and I provide space for growth by weeding out undesirable plants. And of course, there are lots of cycles of there are cycles of energy, water, and nutrients in the garden, and I, as a gardener, contribute to some of those cycles by, for instance, adding compost to add nutrients to the garden. To really understand how this garden functions as an ecosystem, though, you have to think about it from different scales. So we're going to be discussing ecological concepts that occur at different scales, from the global scale down to the population scale. And just as a brief overview, processes that happen at the global scale affect the entire planet. Things like sea surface temperature changes that result in an El Nino or a La Nina year, long-term climate change, sea level rise. At the landscape level, we're talking about land uses and broad types of living plant communities like rainforests, grasslands, or temperate forests. At the ecosystem level, ecosystems can be very large or very small, but ecosystems are looking at the hydrological cycle, nutrient cycle, and other cycles as they relate to living organisms. Communities are, of course, the assemblage of species in a given area, and then populations are groups of a single species. For this webinar, I won't be covering much about populations, but for the landscaper, this topic would be relevant for understanding the difference between cultivars and straight species, why planting species that are rare in a particular area might not be a good idea, and for understanding the growth cycles of both plants and insects. Hopefully that can be a topic for a future webinar. In an hour, I can only cover so much about the basics of ecology. So in this webinar, there'll be 3 sections. The first section is going to cover the landscape scale, the second, ecosystem processes, and the third, community processes. So it's useful to think about where you work in a broad context. The living areas of the Earth, or biosphere, can be divided into biomes, large areas with relatively uniform vegetation types. They're defined primarily by mean annual temperature and precipitation. One of the reasons why it's important to think about this is because many of the non-native plants we grow come from the same biome in different parts of the world. So, for example, if you're in the temperate deciduous forest, many of the plants that you see in the nursery industry are coming from China, where there's also large areas of temperate deciduous forest. At a local level, you learn what physiographic region you're in, the terrain and geology, and what watershed you live in. You can often find useful information at the watershed level through the EPA's Surf Your Watershed site. And I wanted to mention that there is a link that will be provided to you, if it hasn't already, that tells you that includes a handout with all the references that I mentioned in this talk, as well as some additional references. So don't feel like you need to try to write down all the links and references as I'm going through the webinar. But anyway, this site is very useful because it has information about how much of their watershed is developed, and it can also often include information about local watershed groups and programs for your watershed. So for instance, there are some municipalities in our area that provide funding for homeowners to install rain gardens or other stormwater control landscaping plans. So when I'm developing a plan for a site, I like to look up information on the watershed to get an idea of how my site might be affected by surrounding land uses, and to put the site in context within the local watershed. So Risa, can we try our first poll here? Risa, can you hear me?
Sorry, Sylvan, I can hear you.
Well,
I was muted.
okay.
I was muted and I unmuted. I couldn't find where to unmute myself. So I just launched it. Okay, wait, let me just see. Wait, launch poll. So bear with me. Oh, there we go. Okay, so we're going to try polling. Um, and everybody can, oh, the numbers are coming in. Now, Sylvan, you can't see the poll, right?
No, I can't see the poll. I thought I would be able to.
Okay, so it's actually really cool. But so it tells you how many people have voted. So we'll just wait for a few more people to vote, and then I'll let you know where people live. But we've have over 77% of people have voted, and
And actually, if your biome is not listed there, and you can always type in the question area or chat area what biome you're in, or even what part of the country you're in.
so okay, well, most of the votes are in, so which is really cool. So 69% of people live in the temperate deciduous forest area, 19% in grasslands, 7% in the desert, and 4% in temperate rainforest, and 5% in other. So that's yeah, and mostly everybody voted. So that's very cool.
All right, thanks everyone. As Risa said, this is sort of a new technology for us, so you'll have to bear with us for some things, but we hope the polls will make things a little more interactive. So, Risa, it looks like you need to close the poll so I can go back to showing my screen. There we go. I think. Okay. So this map shows Bethesda, Maryland, just north of Washington, D.C. You can see, oh, maybe you can, okay, here you can see Bethesda over here, and Rock Creek Park is over here. It's a very long, narrow park that runs from D.C. North, and you can see major roadways in yellow. Most of our landscapes are a patchwork of land uses, including forest, backyards, parking lots, and streams. Large patches of natural area, like forests, wetlands, and meadows, will support more species than small patches. But many species need a way to move from one patch to another. So could a corridor of vegetation be created to allow species to travel from Rock Creek Park over past this golf course here to this little forest patch in the lower left corner? What if everyone in these neighborhoods could be convinced to transform their yard into a habitat suitable for native plants and wildlife? In a community focusing on protecting high-quality forests and wetlands and connecting them through corridors of green space to other parks and preserves will help support plants and animals in the entire area. Our landscapes are partly a product of human and natural disturbances. Types of disturbances affecting plant communities could be natural disturbances like fires, storms, pests and diseases, or landslides, or they can be human-caused disturbances like logging, mining, farming, or development. It's the frequency and intensity of disturbances that can change what species grow in a particular area. For instance, in a southern temperate forest with frequent fires, loblolly pine would be favored over thin-barked red maple and beech because the loblolly pine is more fire-tolerant. A severe hurricane might return a forest to an early successional stage, but a minor windstorm might just create some gaps that favor fast-growing trees but leave the surrounding late successional forest intact. Prolonged drought coupled with insect outbreaks in the southwest are converting pinyon juniper woodlands to desert grasslands. Human activities mimic disturbances in some ways. Plowing, for example, exposes bare soil similar to a landslide or flood, but it breaks up the soil in a different way. Logging creates canopy gaps or large cleared areas like a storm would, but loggers would likely selectively take certain trees and fewer snags would be left. Those are just some examples of the differences between human and natural disturbances. The frequency and extent of the human activities also influences future plant and animal communities. As landscapers and gardeners, we often create small-scale disturbances by exposing bare ground, mowing, or removing trees and shrubs. Because of disturbances, plant communities do not remain static over time. Succession is the change in species composition over time within a community. And it can be divided into primary succession, where organisms colonize where there's no pre-existing community, like after a rock slide or a volcano explodes, or even on a rock or beach sand, versus secondary succession, where plants are colonizing a pre-existing community. And so that would be the example here, where this field might eventually succeed to be a forest. It's very important to think of succession as an ongoing process and not a linear process. In an old-growth forest even, trees fall and they leave gaps that are filled with fast-growing early successional plants, for instance. As communities mature, they generally gain a more complex structure, and they're home to more different species. So in this forest over here, you can see that there are tall canopy trees, there are trees in the mid-level of the canopy, and an assortment of plants at the ground level. And this variety, this diversity of levels in the forest create many more different habitats for animals, and we'll be talking about habitats specifically later. Think about what stage of succession the landscape you're working on is in. We are usually working with secondary succession rather than primary succession. Gardens undergo succession too, and gardeners and landscapers do many things to change the course of succession. We tend to select certain species over others as we're weeding or making choices in plantings. We create bare ground through tilling or digging, and we might plant a late successional tree species in a lawn. Maintaining a meadow, for example, is a choice to favor a certain successional stage through frequent disturbance, whether you mow or burn to keep out woody species. It's also important to understand how people have influenced the landscape that we now live in. Native Americans had a big influence on the landscape before European settlement, particularly in regions where they had larger scale agriculture. They also used fire to manage some landscapes. Extensive land clearing in the eastern U.S. began in the 1700s as European settlers cleared fields and iron furnaces consumed acres of wood for smelting iron ore. Deforestation increased rapidly starting in the early 1800s across the eastern United States and then into the western United States. Forest conservation initiatives and abandonment of marginal agricultural fields in the 20th century led to some regrowth of forests, but more recently second growth forests are being cut down again to make way for housing developments, roads, and office parks. The growth of suburbs after World War II changed many landscapes around U.S. cities. In the western United States, introduction of cattle altered many landscapes forever, as did poor farming practices and a prolonged drought that led to the Dust Bowl. Fire suppression in different parts of the U.S. have also changed forests, resulting in higher tree densities in some places and different sets of species than you would have found before fire suppression. The legacy of land use includes changes to soils. There's many areas with compacted soils or where topsoil has been lost through erosion, changes to streams. The amount of sedimentation that followed deforestation in the 1800s really was just amazing, and some stream beds are now feet above where they were originally because of all the sediment that flowed into those streams. Many of our streams in urban areas have been channelized, and the increased runoff in urban areas has really damaged a lot of streams and has also increased water pollution. The increase in impervious surfaces in urban areas has also increased, and this, if you think about a forest, if there's a rainstorm in a forest, only about 10% of water from a storm ends up as runoff, but in an urban area, runoff increases to about 20% or more. Plant and animal communities have been affected as their habitats have been fragmented and they've lost migratory pathways. There's been a loss of pollinators and seed dispersers, introduction of exotic species, and changes in fire regimes. So learning about land use history in the area where you work can help you evaluate factors such as the health of soils, streams, and plant communities at a site, and to help you recognize what changes might have taken place at that site, and help you decide what the best landscaping solution might be. Okay, so I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions about this first section.
Okay, Sylvan, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. No questions coming in. Just a few people not able to connect. So, but
okay.
Okay. So here's one question from Marini. I hope I said that. How do you best research land use history?
Yeah, it depends on what region you're in. Increasingly information's available online. You can, there's some good histories about land use in different areas, but for your specific site, you probably need to look back at old land records or aerial photographs. It's getting easier if you go through the USGS, the US Geological Survey, to find old aerial photographs of your site, and you can see whether that site used to be agricultural land and how long ago that was, or whether it was forested, or what land use change has happened over time.
Okay, I think we're, any other questions? Again, just remember the question box is on your control panel, and people have been using it. Oh, wait. So Stephen Zine, I hope I pronounced that properly, Stephen, but he said that some soil surveys have old land use. Do you know what that means?
Yes, soil surveys are another good resource. Yeah. You can actually also look on Google Earth, and they have a feature where you can look back at old aerial images on Google Earth as well. For some regions, it sort of depends on where you are. Okay, so I'm going to move on then to talking about ecosystem processes. So the study of ecosystems looks at the flow of energy, water, and nutrients through living systems. And gaining an understanding of these cycles helps to explain what sustainability means from an ecological point of view. Changing the balance within these cycles leads to fundamental ecological changes that affect human well-being. So as designers and landscapers, you can use your knowledge of these cycles to understand things like composting, improving stormwater management, and integrated pest management. For this webinar, we'll be looking briefly at the flow of energy, water, carbon, and nitrogen. And I have to say that, that ecosystem processes have never been the most exciting topic to me, but I do feel they're incredibly important. So I hope this will be a review for most of you. But plants photosynthesize, they convert carbon dioxide from the air and use the energy of the sun to convert the carbon dioxide into sugars through photosynthesis. It takes place in the green-colored chlorophyll structures in the cells of the plant. Sugar is then an organic compound which can be used in combination with other molecules to make the tissues of the plant. The plant gets these other molecules such as nitrogen and iron through its roots. Animals get their energy by eating the organic molecules of plants or other animals. And often animal behavior is strongly influenced by the search for food, so that's something to consider if you're interested in wildlife, in creating wildlife habitat. For example, some animals establish territories like fox or wrens, and other animals are generalist predators. They'll eat many different types of food, such as a deer, or others are specialists, like the monarch butterfly caterpillar in this picture, which only feeds on plants in the milkweed family. Food webs represent how energy flows from one organism to another, and they show the complexity that develops within communities. Think about what would happen if one of these organisms were to disappear from this food web. For example, if this if a pollinator of these flowers here were to disappear, then the mouse would have fewer seeds to eat potentially, and mice populations would decline, and that would mean less food for snakes, hawks, and this fox or wolf up here. Pollinators, in this case, might be an example of a keystone species, a species whose importance is greater than its relative abundance in the ecosystem. Something else that you can think of in relation to a food web are insect outbreaks. For example, if there were an increase in grasshoppers, there would be less food available for deer and mice because the grasshoppers would deplete the plants that they ate. Often food webs have been disrupted in urban areas or even in rural areas where large predators are viewed as enemies of livestock or pesticide use has inadvertently killed off pollinators. Consider how the food web might have been altered where you're working and what you can do to increase the complexity and the stability of the food web. Fresh, clean water is an increasingly scarce resource throughout the world. Even though 71% of the Earth's surface is covered by water, less than 1% is fresh water in lakes, rivers, and groundwater. Another 2% of water is held in polar ice caps and glaciers, and the remaining 97% of water is contained in the oceans. Most people have a good general understanding of how the water cycle works. Water evaporates from lakes and the ocean and rivers. That water condenses in the atmosphere and is returned to Earth as rain or snow. It runs downhill into lakes and rivers. Some of it infiltrates into the ground and is stored there as groundwater, filling in pores in the soil, or it percolates into underground aquifers. If groundwater reaches the surface through a spring or a lake, or just because of a high water table, that water rejoins the surface waters of lakes and rivers. So let's look at how human activities have altered the water cycle. Obviously, hard surfaces have increased surface area runoff. Built environments also tend to have compacted soils that can't hold as much water and less evapotranspiration since there are fewer plants. Groundwater is used up as people pump water from wells, and there is less recharge of groundwater because areas where water used to be able to slowly infiltrate are gone. More rainfall reaches the ground because there are fewer plants intercepting rainfall, and natural drainage patterns have disappeared. Water tends to move faster across the landscape in a storm sewer or a channelized river than it would have with wetlands and curving streams in place. Features such as rain gardens, wetlands, and better plant choices can help keep the water cycle in balance.